Hello, my name is Lisette Valenzuela, and I will be talking about the Mexican American civil rights. My thesis is that I will argue that Mexican Americans should have been treated the same as everyone, despite them having Mexican descent. The topics I will be talking about are the Chicano movement, Hernandez versus Texas, and the 14th Amendment. Since I am arguing that Mexican Americans were treated unfairly, my supporting argument is that they should have never been discriminated or segregated. So I will be giving examples of discrimination and segregation. Mexican Americans were discriminated against in 1931. Police officers in Los Angeles grabbed Mexican Americans and put them forcefully into vans. When they were escorted into the vans, they were deported to Mexico. The police officers arrested about 400 people. The officers deported the Mexican Americans because of them having Mexican descent, despite them even being born in America. The raid was just one incident in a long history of discrimination against Mexican Americans in the United States. An example of segregation was in the 1920s in Southern California. In Southern California, they had quote unquote Mexican schools. In 1931, 85% of California schools segregated children of Mexican descent in either separate classrooms or schools. They also had separate swimming pools, movie theaters, and restaurants. I will now be talking about the Chicano movement. So the Chicano movement was a social and political movement to show the importance of people that were American but had Mexican descent. The end goal for the Chicano movement was to fight against racism, increase cultural acceptance, and guarantee that there be equal laboring rights. This movement helped gain respect for their race and culture. It helped decrease discrimination and poverty. They were able to decrease poverty because they were offered more opportunities, such as improved conditions for migrant workers and the hiring of Chicano teachers. Mexican Americans were also able to gain political power. This meaning more Mexican Americans were able to be elected officials. The importance of talking about the Chicano movement is to show the beginning of Mexican Americans being treated equally. The court case I will be talking about is Hernandez versus Texas. Pete Hernandez was indicted for the murder by the grand jury in Jackson County, Texas. The entire jury was all white. There were no Mexican Americans on the jury in Jackson County in over 25 years. The only qualifications you need to be a grand jury member is to be a citizen of the state of Texas and be a qualified voter. As long as you're an American citizen and from Texas, you qualify for all of the requirements. This is what Hernandez's attorneys argued. Hernandez and his legal team argued that there was no equal protection under the 14th Amendment and the jury service was unconstitutional. Since no Mexican American citizen was on the jury, they argued that Mexican Americans were discriminated against. The court denied all motions and sentenced Hernandez to life in prison. When the appeals were made, the conviction was still held. The case was eventually taken to the Supreme Court. Lawyers for the state of Texas did not deny the charge of discrimination, but they argued for the 14th Amendment. And they argued that the 14th Amendment had only applied to African Americans. So now I will be talking about how the 14th Amendment and how the amendment was protected for Hernandez versus Texas. So the 14th Amendment is anyone born in the United States is a citizen and must give citizens the same rights by the federal government. It also gives the citizens the right to due process and equal protection under the law in all states. So Chief Justice Earl Warren and the rest of the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in favor of Hernandez and required to be retried by the jury composed without discrimination against Mexican Americans. Hernandez received a new trial with the jury that included Mexican Americans and was found guilty of murder once again. To determine if discriminatory factors were present in Jackson County, the court investigated the treatment of Mexican Americans. They discovered that the distinction between Mexican and white were a county-wide distinction. When they were looking for distinctions in the county, they had found that one restaurant displayed a sign that said no Mexicans served. As well as they found that Mexican American children attended segregated schools and were forced to drop out by the 5th or 6th grade. These factors led to the Supreme Court for their ultimate ruling that the 14th Amendment protects persons beyond the racial classes of white and black and extends protection to nationality groups of white race as well.